Malcolm Washington stood at the podium, addressing the National Aviation Conference as the room erupted in thunderous applause. 6 months ago, he'd been humiliated on Flight 1382. Today, as the new owner of Skyline Airways, he was changing the industry forever. The woman who had started it all sat frozen in the front row. Before we dive into this incredible story, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe to see more stories about powerful responses to everyday discrimination. Now, let's rewind 6 months to see how one man turned an act of racism into an industry revolution. Malcolm Washington massaged his temples as he settled into Seat 2A aboard Skyline Airways Flight 1382 from Atlanta to San Francisco. At 42, the CEO of Tech Fusion Solutions had just closed a $500 million deal that would revolutionize supply chain management across 3 continents. The exhaustion of the week-long negotiations hung heavy on his shoulders, but satisfaction gleamed in his eyes. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Washington," said Heather Phillips, the 29-year-old flight attendant who had recognized him immediately. "Congratulations on the Meridian acquisition. That was all over the business news this morning." Malcolm smiled warmly. "Thank you, Heather," he said, noting her name tag. "It's been a long week." Malcolm placed his leather portfolio in the seat pocket and removed his custom-tailored jacket, revealing a crisp white shirt and a tie that matched the deep blue of his company logo. His Harvard MBA and the success he'd built from nothing weren't visible markers, but the quiet confidence in his demeanor spoke volumes. Growing up in Chicago's South Side hadn't given him many advantages, but his grandmother had instilled in him an unshakable belief in his own potential. The boarding process continued around him as Malcolm pulled out his tablet to review his presentation for Monday's board meeting. He'd chosen Seat 2A specifically for the privacy it offered, tucked against the window with no seat in front due to the cabin configuration. It was perfect for working during the 4-hour flight. The peaceful preparation was interrupted by a commotion at the front of the cabin. Karen Whitfield had arrived, dragging 2 oversized designer carry-ons despite the airline's one-bag policy. At 52, Karen wore her wealth-like armor, designer sunglasses perched on perfectly highlighted hair, diamonds glinting from her ears, neck, and fingers. "These should go in the closet," she informed the flight attendant without a please or thank you, gesturing to her bags as if they were too precious for the overhead bins where everyone else's luggage went. Malcolm glanced up briefly, then returned to his work. He'd seen this type of entitled behavior countless times before. Karen paused in the aisle, her gaze sweeping the first-class cabin before landing on Malcolm. Her lips tightened almost imperceptibly. "They're just letting anyone into first class these days, aren't they?" she muttered to the gentleman behind her, not quite under her breath. "Must be some kind of upgrade program for their frequent flyers." Malcolm kept his eyes on his screen, practicing the selective deafness he'd perfected throughout his career. As the first black executive at his previous firm, he'd learned when to fight and when to focus on his goals instead. Karen checked her boarding pass, then looked at the seat numbers. She stopped directly beside Malcolm's row, but instead of continuing to 2C, her assigned seat according to the boarding pass she held, she placed her designer purse on the floor and began to sit in 2A, directly on top of Malcolm's open tray table. "Excuse me, ma'am," Malcolm said politely, quickly moving his tablet. "I believe you're about to sit in my seat." Karen settled into the seat without acknowledging him, adjusting herself comfortably as if she hadn't heard a word. "Ma'am." Malcolm tried again, slightly louder. "I think there's been a confusion. This is Seat 2A. Karen removed her sunglasses, turned to him with cold eyes, and spoke with deliberate slowness. "I'm quite aware of what seat this is." "Then you might have noticed it's not the seat on your boarding pass," Malcolm responded, maintaining his professional tone while reaching for his own boarding pass. He held it up, displaying the clearly marked 2A. "See? This is my assigned seat." Karen glanced at his boarding pass with obvious disdain, then returned her gaze to her phone, dismissing him entirely. "I always sit by the window. I'm sure you wouldn't mind moving to the aisle. Or perhaps." Her eyes flicked to the economy section behind them. There might be something more suitable back there. The implication hung in the air like a toxic cloud. A few nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably, but no one intervened. In the confined space of the airplane cabin, the tension was palpable. Malcolm took a deep breath. This wasn't his first encounter with racism, veiled or otherwise. What made this particularly jarring was that he was clearly in first class, clearly established, and still being treated as if he didn't belong. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady but firm, "I specifically booked seat 2A so I could work during this flight. Your assigned seat is 2C. I'd appreciate if you'd move to your correct seat so we can both enjoy this flight." Karen's expression hardened. "Are you telling me where I can and cannot sit?" she asked loudly, drawing attention from throughout the cabin. "I find that extremely aggressive and inappropriate." The chess match had begun, and Malcolm recognized the gambit immediately. The subtle repositioning of victim and aggressor was a tactic he'd seen before, taking an entitled action, then claiming to be threatened when called out on it. "I'm not being aggressive, ma'am," Malcolm replied, keeping his voice level despite the frustration building inside him. "I'm simply pointing out that you're sitting in my assigned seat. I have work to complete during this flight, which is why I specifically selected this seat." Karen's eyes narrowed as she raised her hand to summon a flight attendant. "Excuse me. Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying throughout the first-class cabin. "I need assistance immediately." Heather approached with a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "How can I help you, ma'am?" "This man," Karen said, gesturing toward Malcolm without looking at him, "is harassing me about seating arrangements. I find his tone threatening, and I'm extremely uncomfortable." Malcolm watched the familiar scenario unfold. He'd seen this playbook before: the false accusation, the damsel in distress routine, the expectation that her word would automatically outweigh his. Heather glanced between them, quickly assessing the situation. "Let me check both of your boarding passes to sort this out," she said diplomatically. "That won't be necessary," Karen replied sharply. "I'm the wife of Richard Whitfield, who sits on the board of directors for Skyline Airways. I always sit by the window." "Always." Malcolm silently handed his boarding pass to Heather, who looked at it and nodded. "Sir, you are indeed assigned to seat 2A. She turned to Karen. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass as well?" Karen reluctantly produced her boarding pass, which clearly showed seat 2C. "Mrs. Whitfield, your assigned seat is 2C, the aisle seat in this row," Heather confirmed. "Company policy requires passengers to sit in their assigned seats for the safety and comfort of all passengers." "This is ridiculous," Karen said, her voice rising. "Do you know who my husband is? He won't be pleased to hear about this treatment." By now, several passengers had their phones out, discreetly recording the interaction. The quiet businessman in row 3 was live streaming to his substantial social media following. "I'm not asking for special treatment," Malcolm said calmly. "Just for the assigned seating to be respected." "Special treatment?" Karen scoffed. "That's rich, coming from you. We all know how you people get into these positions." The cabin fell silent at the unmistakable racial undertone. Malcolm felt a familiar heaviness settle in his chest, the weight of centuries of prejudice condensed into a single moment at 30,000 feet. "Captain Stevens to the first-class cabin, please." "Captain Stevens to first class," Heather spoke into the intercom, recognizing that the situation was escalating beyond her authority. Malcolm remained stoic, though his mind raced with memories of similar incidents throughout his life. Being followed in high-end stores, being asked if he was lost when walking into executive meetings, having to work twice as hard for half the recognition. He'd built a 9-figure company from the ground up, yet here he was, still fighting for the most basic dignity. Captain Gregory Stevens, a 58-year-old veteran pilot with silver hair and a commanding presence, emerged from the cockpit. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, surveying the scene. Before Heather could explain, Karen interjected. "This man is being incredibly hostile about seating arrangements. I don't feel safe flying with him behaving this way. She's sitting in my assigned seat, Malcolm explained evenly. I've politely asked her to move to her assigned seat so I can work during the flight. Captain Stevens examined both boarding passes. Mrs. Whitfield, you are indeed in the wrong seat. I must ask you to move to your assigned seat, 2C. Karen pulled out her phone. I'm calling Richard right now. He won't be happy to hear about this treatment of his wife. As she dialed, she continued loudly, Richard always takes care of people who don't know their place. The threat hung in the air. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably. Malcolm felt a familiar surge of anger but suppressed it. Throughout his career, he'd learned that showing even a fraction of the emotion he felt would immediately brand him as the angry black man, a stereotype that would undermine everything he'd worked for. Karen's voice rose as she spoke into her phone. Richard, darling, you won't believe what's happening. They're trying to move me from my seat 4, one of them. She emphasized the last words while staring directly at Malcolm. Captain Stevens, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating situation and aware of the delay it was causing, leaned toward Malcolm. Sir, I apologize, but perhaps you wouldn't mind taking another first-class seat just this once. We have 1B open, and it would allow us to depart on time. Malcolm recognized the unfairness immediately. He was being asked to accommodate racism to avoid inconveniencing others. It was a familiar compromise, one that prioritized comfort over confronting injustice. With all due respect, Captain, Malcolm began, but looking around at the increasingly restless passengers and considering the importance of making his meeting in San Francisco, he finally nodded. Fine. I'll move. The capitulation tasted bitter, but Malcolm had learned to choose his battles. As he gathered his belongings, Karen smiled triumphantly, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Thank you for your understanding, sir, Captain Stevens said quietly, having the decency to look somewhat ashamed. As Malcolm moved to seat 1B, Karen's voice carried through the cabin. Some people just need to learn their place. Malcolm settled into seat 1B, the weight of the injustice still heavy on his shoulders. As he arranged his work materials, a deep voice came from beside him. That was straight up wrong, what happened to you? Malcolm turned to find himself facing Elijah Bennett, a 35-year-old black venture capitalist he'd seen at several industry events. Elijah Bennett, the man said, extending his hand. Threshold Ventures. Malcolm Washington, Tech Fusion Solutions, Malcolm replied, shaking his hand. You were at the Detroit Tech Summit last year, right? That's right, Elijah confirmed. Your keynote on AI ethics was the highlight of the conference. He lowered his voice. And for what it's worth, I know Richard Whitfield. He's exactly what you'd expect from that little display his wife just put on. Malcolm nodded slightly, adjusting his laptop. Unfortunately, nothing about that situation surprised me. That's what makes it worse, Elijah said. The predictability doesn't diminish the impact. As the flight attendants prepared for takeoff, Malcolm tried to refocus on his work, but the humiliation of the incident lingered. Despite building a company valued at over $2 billion, despite his Harvard MBA, despite every achievement on his impeccable resume, he could still be reduced to one of them in an instant. Throughout the flight, he caught Karen making smug glances in his direction, each look a reminder of the entitlement that had displaced him from his rightful seat. Working on his presentation, Malcolm found himself flashing back to other moments in his career, being mistaken for the IT support when he was actually the lead investor at a pitch meeting, being asked to show ID when white colleagues walked right into the same building, having his ideas ignored until a white colleague repeated them. Each memory fueled a quiet determination that had been building within him for years. Midway through the flight, Malcolm observed Karen berating a young flight attendant named Jasmine Taylor. The 24-year-old black woman stood with professional composure as Karen complained that her champagne wasn't chilled properly. Do they not train you people properly? Karen's voice carried through the cabin. Or perhaps you're just not capable of understanding simple instructions. Jasmine maintained her composure. I apologize for the inconvenience, ma'am. I'd be happy to bring you another beverage. Don't bother, Karen snapped. I'll speak to your supervisor about the declining standards on these flights. Malcolm stood up and approached them. Excuse me, he said politely to Jasmine. When you have a moment, could I get a sparkling water, please? Of course, sir, Jasmine replied with genuine appreciation in her eyes for the simple respect. And I wanted to commend you on your professionalism, Malcolm added. It's refreshing to see such excellent customer service. Karen glared at him, recognizing the subtle rebuke in his praise of Jasmine. As Malcolm returned to his seat, Elijah gave him a knowing nod. Well played. By the time the flight began its descent into San Francisco, Malcolm had formulated the beginnings of a plan. The incident, painful as it was, had crystallized something he'd been considering for months: how to address systemic discrimination in corporate America not just through talks and training, but through structural change. As passengers prepared to disembark, Malcolm noticed several people surreptitiously taking photos of Karen, who was now loudly complaining about the landing being too rough. That video of what happened earlier is already trending, Elijah commented, showing Malcolm his phone screen. A clip titled, "Racist Karen Forces Black CEO Out of His Seat," had already garnered thousands of views and was climbing rapidly. Here's my card, Elijah said, handing Malcolm his business card with a personal number scribbled on the back. I have some information about Skyline Airways that might interest you. Let's talk soon. As Malcolm stepped off the plane, his phone began buzzing incessantly with notifications. His executive team was messaging him about the viral video, concerned about potential PR implications for TechFusion. But Malcolm wasn't thinking about damage control. For the first time in his career, he was thinking about leveraging an incident of discrimination rather than simply rising above it. The spark of an idea had ignited, and he felt a sense of purpose that transcended the humiliation he'd experienced. Karen Whitfield had no idea what she had set in motion when she took his seat. 3 days after the flight incident, Malcolm sat in the sleek conference room of his San Francisco office, facing his legal team. The glass walls offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, but his focus remained on the matter at hand. The video has over 5 million views now, said Zoe Richardson, his 38-year-old chief legal counsel, sliding a tablet across the polished table. You've received speaking requests from major networks, and #SkySeatRacism is trending nationwide. Malcolm scrolled through the analytics. What are our options here, Zoe? Zoe, a Harvard Law graduate who'd left a prestigious firm to join TechFusion 2 years ago, leaned forward. We could pursue a discrimination claim against Skyline Airways. The evidence is clear, and public sentiment is overwhelmingly on your side. But? Malcolm prompted, sensing her hesitation. But it would be time-consuming, potentially distracting from our core business, and the compensation would be minimal compared to what you could make focusing on TechFusion's growth. Malcolm nodded thoughtfully. This isn't about compensation for me. It's about accountability. I figured you'd say that, Zoe replied with a knowing smile. Which is why I've already had my team looking into Skyline Airways history. She distributed folders to everyone at the table. Skyline has had 27 discrimination complaints filed against them in the past 3 years alone. Most were settled quietly with NDAs, but the pattern is clear. Malcolm flipped through the documents, a grim expression settling on his face. So what happened to me wasn't an isolated incident. Not even close, Zoe confirmed. And here's where it gets interesting. Skyline Airways is facing financial difficulties they've been keeping quiet. Their latest quarterly report painted a rosy picture, but our financial analyst found discrepancies suggesting they're significantly overleveraged. The door opened, and Malcolm's assistant ushered in Elijah Bennett. Thank you for coming, Elijah, Malcolm said, standing to shake his hand. When you told me what you were considering, I knew I had to be here, Elijah replied. I brought some information that might help. Elijah connected his laptop to the conference room's display. As I mentioned on the flight, I know Richard Whitfield professionally. What I didn't mention is that my firm was considering an investment in Skyline Airways last year before we pulled out. Charts and graphs appeared on the screen, detailing Skyline's precarious financial position. "The airline has been mismanaged for years," Elijah explained. Richard Whitfield and CEO William Harrison have been covering up not just discrimination complaints but also safety concerns and financial mismanagement. Malcolm studied the data. And Karen Whitfield's behavior? Not an anomaly, Elijah confirmed. Richard has settled at least 3 separate incidents involving his wife's treatment of Skyline employees, all people of color, by the way. As the meeting continued, Malcolm's phone buzzed with a message from his executive team. They were concerned about his focus on the Skyline issue instead of their pending deal with a major tech firm in Japan. "Your team worried you're getting distracted?" Zoe asked, noticing his expression. "They don't understand yet," Malcolm replied. "This isn't a distraction. It's an opportunity to address something bigger than just one incident." After the meeting, Malcolm reached out to Jasmine Taylor, the flight attendant from Flight 1382. Her initial hesitation to speak with him dissolved when he explained his intentions. "It wasn't just that one flight, Mr. Washington," Jasmine told him during their phone call. "It's a pattern at Skyline. Management tells us to accommodate certain passengers, even when they're clearly in the wrong. Would you be willing to introduce me to other employees who've had similar experiences?" Malcolm asked. "More than willing," Jasmine replied. "There are dozens of us who've been waiting for someone to take this seriously." Over the next week, Malcolm spoke with 15 current and former Skyline employees who shared stories of discrimination that had been systematically swept under the rug. A pattern emerged of a corporate culture that protected wealthy, predominantly white passengers and board members at the expense of employees and customers of color. During a virtual board meeting for Tech Fusion, several members expressed concern about Malcolm's growing involvement in the Skyline matter. "We respect your personal experience, Malcolm," said Franklin Pierce, the 70-year-old chairman of his board. "But is this the best use of your time as CEO? The Jensen acquisition needs your attention." "I understand your concerns," Malcolm replied. "But I assure you, this isn't taking away from my commitments to Tech Fusion. In fact, I believe it aligns perfectly with our company values of integrity and equality." The board remained skeptical, but Malcolm had earned enough trust over the years that they were willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, for now. That evening, as Malcolm reviewed the growing file of evidence against Skyline Airways, his determination solidified into a concrete plan. This wasn't just about one woman taking his seat or even about his personal humiliation. It was about a systemic problem that affected countless people every day. Have you ever had to choose between speaking up against discrimination and just going with the flow to avoid conflict? Comment number 1 if you would have confronted Karen immediately, or number 2 if you would have taken the other seat to avoid the drama. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of justice and transformation. Now, what do you think Malcolm's planning to do with all this information he's gathering about Skyline Airways? Is he building a case for a lawsuit, or does he have something bigger in mind? Let's continue and find out how this CEO is about to change the game entirely. The lobby of Skyline Airways headquarters gleamed with polished marble and steel, projecting an image of prosperity that Malcolm now knew was largely facade. He straightened his tie as the receptionist announced his arrival to CEO William Harrison. "Mr. Washington," Harrison greeted him 10 minutes later, emerging from the elevator with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "What a surprise to have you visit us personally." At 61, Harrison had the tan of someone who spent more time on golf courses than in boardrooms, and the confident handshake of a man unaccustomed to being challenged. "I appreciate you seeing me on short notice," Malcolm replied, matching Harrison's firm grip. Of course. Though I must say, our customer relations department could have handled any concerns about your recent flight. No need for the CEO of Tech Fusion to make a special trip." Harrison led Malcolm to a corner office with panoramic views of the Atlanta skyline. "Now, what can I do for you today?" Malcolm took a seat across from Harrison's imposing desk. "I think you know why I'm here, William. The incident on Flight 1382 wasn't acceptable. Harrison's smile tightened. Ah, yes. An unfortunate misunderstanding. We've reviewed the situation, and while we regret any inconvenience, our staff followed protocol by finding you an alternative seat of equal value. Equal value? Malcolm raised an eyebrow. Is that how Skyline Airways views asking a passenger to surrender their assigned seat to accommodate racist behavior? Harrison's friendly demeanor faltered slightly. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Washington. Mrs. Whitfield is the wife of one of our board members, and I'm sure there was no racial motivation to her seating preference. Malcolm maintained steady eye contact. We both know that's not true. But I'm not here to debate what happened. I'm here to discuss Skyline's response. Harrison leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. Very well. As a gesture of goodwill, Skyline is prepared to offer you 50,000 Sky Miles and a voucher for a future first-class flight. We value your business and hope this addresses your concerns. Malcolm couldn't help but laugh. That's your solution? Miles and a voucher? It's quite generous by industry standards, Harrison replied stiffly. I'm not interested in miles or vouchers, Malcolm stated. I'm interested in accountability and change. Harrison's expression hardened. Mr. Washington, if you're considering legal action, should remind you that our terms of service. I'm well aware of your terms of service, Malcolm interrupted. Just as I'm aware of the 27 discrimination complaints filed against Skyline in the past 3 years. Or the fact that your company has systematically covered up racist incidents involving high-value customers and board members. The color drained from Harrison's face. Where did you get that information? That's not important, Malcolm replied. What's important is what happens next. Harrison recovered quickly, his face settling into a mask of corporate indifference. If you're attempting to leverage one unfortunate incident into some sort of crusade, I'm afraid you'll find Skyline Airways well prepared legally. I'm not here to threaten a lawsuit, Malcolm said calmly. I'm here to inform you that I've partnered with Faith Jordan at the National Times. She's been investigating Skyline for months, and now has access to testimony from 15 of your current and former employees about discriminatory practices. Faith Jordan was a 33-year-old investigative journalist known for exposing corporate malfeasance. Her recent series on workplace discrimination had won a Pulitzer. Harrison's face flushed. You're bluffing. Malcolm slid a folder across the desk. Her article goes live tomorrow. I wanted to give you the courtesy of a heads up, one CEO to another. Harrison flipped through the documents, his expression growing increasingly grim. Richard Whitfield won't stand for this. I'm counting on that, Malcolm replied. In fact, I had a very interesting call with Mr. Whitfield yesterday. He threatened to destroy me if I pursued this matter. Fortunately, I recorded that call. Malcolm stood to leave. You have until tomorrow morning to issue a public apology and outline specific steps Skyline will take to address its discriminatory practices. After that, it's out of my hands. As Malcolm turned to leave, Harrison called after him. You're making a serious mistake. Richard has connections throughout the industry. He can make things very difficult for you and Tech Fusion. Malcolm paused at the door. Perhaps. But some things are more important than business convenience. I'll see myself out. As Malcolm's car pulled away from Skyline headquarters, he made 2 calls. The first was to Elijah Bennett. How did it go? Elijah asked. Exactly as expected, Malcolm replied. Harrison offered miles and a voucher. And phase 2? Already in motion. How's your end coming along? Elijah's smile was audible in his voice. I've secured commitments from 3 institutional investors. They're ready to move as soon as you give the word. Excellent. And what about the employee coalition? Jasmine has organized 28 current and former employees willing to go on record. Faith Jordan is finalizing the article now. Malcolm's second call was to his broker. It's time, he said simply. Begin acquiring Skyline shares according to our discussed strategy. Keep each purchase under the reporting threshold. That evening, Richard Whitfield called Malcolm directly, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. You think you can threaten Skyline Airways? Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? I'm not threatening anyone, Mr. Whitfield, Malcolm replied calmly. I'm simply advocating for accountability. Listen to me carefully, Whitfield hissed. I've been in this industry for 30 years. I've crushed people far more powerful than you. By the time I'm done, you'll wish you'd taken the miles and kept your mouth shut. Is that a threat, Mr. Whitfield? It's a promise. I have friends on your board. Friends in your supply chain. Friends who can ensure TechFusion never secures another major contract. Malcolm remained silent for a moment, letting Whitfield fill the void with his own anger. Are you finished? Malcolm finally asked. This is just the beginning, Whitfield snapped before hanging up. Malcolm forwarded the recorded call to his legal team, then checked his news alerts. The story was beginning to gain traction beyond social media. 3 major news networks had reached out for interviews, and hashtag SkySeatRacism had evolved into hashtag Skyline Accountability. Meanwhile, in the Whitfield household, Karen was preparing for a morning television appearance, convinced she could explain away the viral video. Her PR team had advised against it, but Karen, like her husband, was unaccustomed to being told no. As Malcolm reviewed the latest developments with his team late that night, a notification popped up on his phone. Skyline's stock had dropped 3% in after-hours trading on rumors of forthcoming negative press. It was just the beginning. Malcolm's phone buzzed at 6:30 a.m. with a text from Faith Jordan, article is live. Brace for impact. He opened the National Times website to find the headline, Pattern of Discrimination, Inside Skyline Airways Toxic Culture. The comprehensive exposé featured testimony from current and former employees, detailed previously unreported incidents, and included analysis of the company's handling of discrimination complaints. By 8 a.m., Skyline stock had dropped 7% in pre-market trading. At 8:30 a.m., Karen Whitfield appeared on Morning America, wearing a pastel suit and a practiced expression of wounded innocence. I'm deeply hurt by the accusations, she told the host, her voice quavering slightly. I've always respected diversity. Some of my closest friends are people of color. When asked about taking Malcolm's seat, she offered a revisionist version of events. I simply had a preference for the window, and he became confrontational. The video circulating online has been edited to make me appear racist. The host, prepared with unedited footage, played the clip where Karen clearly said, we all know how you people get into these positions. What did you mean by, you people? The host asked. Karen's composure cracked. I meant tech executives, obviously. They're always so entitled. The interview spiraled downward from there, with Karen eventually removing her microphone and walking off set when questioned about her history of similar incidents. By market open, Skyline stock had fallen 12%. Malcolm watched these developments from his office while simultaneously overseeing the accelerated acquisition of Skyline shares. The plummeting price meant his investment firm could acquire a larger stake than initially projected. We've secured 7% of outstanding shares, his broker reported mid-morning. At this rate, we'll hit our target within 2 weeks rather than 2 months. Good, Malcolm replied. Keep it under the radar for now. Throughout the day, Malcolm fielded calls from media outlets requesting comments. He declined all interviews, preferring to let the evidence speak for itself. Meanwhile, Skyline's PR team worked overtime issuing statements that alternated between defending the company and promising to review policies. The situation intensified when Captain Gregory Stevens, who had been on Flight 1382, came forward with a statement. What happened to Mr. Washington was wrong, and it wasn't an isolated incident. Skyline has an unwritten policy of appeasing certain passengers at the expense of others, and it disproportionately affects people of color. By day's end, Skyline had lost 17% of its market value, and #SkySeatRacism had become the top trending topic nationwide. Richard Whitfield made his first public move the following day, calling an emergency board meeting at Skyline. Unknown to him, Malcolm had already established back-channel communications with 3 board members who were uncomfortable with the company's direction. Whitfield is planning to blacklist TechFusion from airline industry partnerships, reported Sandra Chen, one of the sympathetic board members. He's also reaching out to your investors, suggesting that your crusade is distracting you from running your company. Malcolm had anticipated this. Let him try. Our investors know where I stand, and they've seen our Q2 results. The corporate chess match accelerated over the next week. Richard Whitfield orchestrated a series of maneuvers designed to insulate Skyline from external pressure, including a poison pill provision to prevent hostile takeovers. Meanwhile, Malcolm continued quietly acquiring shares while building a coalition of institutional investors concerned about Skyline's ethical practices and financial stability. Heather Phillips, the flight attendant from Flight 1382, risked her job by providing internal emails documenting how Skyline management instructed staff to give preferential treatment to certain passengers, particularly board members and their families, regardless of assigned seating or company policies. The turning point came when Malcolm received a call from William Harrison himself. "This has gone far enough," the CEO said, his voice weary. "What will it take to end this?" "Real change," Malcolm replied. "Not just a press release or a one-day diversity training. Be specific. A complete overhaul of your discrimination policies, with clear consequences regardless of who the offender is. A diverse board that actually represents your customers and employees. And the resignation of anyone who enabled or participated in covering up these incidents." Harrison laughed bitterly. "You're asking for Richard Whitfield's head on a platter." "I'm asking for accountability," Malcolm corrected. "If Mr. Whitfield can't operate within ethical boundaries, then yes, he should step down." "He'll never agree to that," Harrison said. "And he has enough allies on the board to block any such move. Then I guess we'll see how the shareholders feel when they learn about the safety violations your company has also been hiding." The line went silent for a moment. "What safety violations?" "The ones documented by your former head of maintenance, who's been waiting for someone to take his concerns seriously for 2 years. After the call ended, Malcolm received a message from an unknown number. "This is beyond business now. Watch your back. RW." Malcolm forwarded the message to his security team and legal counsel. The threat only reinforced his determination. That night, as he reviewed the latest financial reports showing his ownership stake in Skyline had reached 11%, Malcolm reflected on how a simple act of discrimination had escalated into a corporate war. What had begun as a personal humiliation had revealed a systemic problem that affected countless individuals. His phone rang again. Elijah Bennett. "You've got to see this," Elijah said without preamble. "Richard Whitfield just appeared on CNBC claiming you're attempting a hostile takeover to settle a personal vendetta. He's painting himself as the victim." Malcolm switched on the television to see Richard Whitfield, impeccably dressed in a conservative suit, speaking with practiced indignation. "Mr. Washington is using his considerable resources to attack a company because of a simple misunderstanding involving my wife. This isn't about discrimination, it's about an ego that can't handle being asked to move seats." The interviewer, to her credit, pushed back. "But what about the documented pattern of discrimination at Skyline? The testimony from your own employees?" Whitfield waved dismissively. "Disgruntled former employees and a few incidents blown out of proportion. Every company has its challenges. The real story here is how a tech CEO is trying to bring down an airline because his feelings were hurt." Malcolm turned off the television, a cold determination settling over him. "Time for the next phase," he told Elijah. "How close are we to 20% ownership?" "At the current acquisition rate, about 1 week away." "Accelerate it," Malcolm instructed. "I want to reach the threshold before their next board meeting." As he hung up, Malcolm received a text from Jasmine Taylor. The employee coalition has grown to 42 members. We're ready whenever you are. The pieces were falling into place. What Richard Whitfield didn't understand was that Malcolm wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for Jasmine, for Heather, for Captain Stevens, and for everyone who had ever been told to accept discrimination as the cost of doing business. The real battle was just beginning. The Skyline Airways boardroom hummed with tension as directors filed in for the emergency meeting. The company's stock had fallen 28% in 2 weeks, media coverage remained overwhelmingly negative, and flight bookings had dropped significantly. Richard Whitfield sat at the head of the table, his customary confidence now edged with desperation. CEO William Harrison looked equally haggard, his usual golf course tan now ashen under the boardroom lights. "We need to end this now," Harrison began without preamble. "The damage to our brand is becoming irreparable. What we need," Whitfield countered, "is to stand firm against this attack. Washington is bluffing. He can't possibly acquire enough shares to threaten our control." Sandra Chen, the board member who had been feeding information to Malcolm, cleared her throat. "Actually, Richard, I've been reviewing the recent SEC filings. TechFusion Investment Partners has acquired significant holdings in Skyline over the past 2 weeks." "How significant?" Harrison asked, alarm evident in his voice. "Nearly 14% as of yesterday," Sandra replied. "And there are rumors of a coalition forming among institutional investors." Whitfield dismissed this with a wave. "Rumors. Besides, even if he has 14%, that's nowhere near enough for a takeover." The boardroom doors opened, and the corporate secretary entered. "Excuse me, but there's someone here who insists on attending this meeting. He says he's a shareholder." "We're in the middle of an emergency session," Harrison snapped. "Tell them to make an appointment. He says he owns 31% of the company and has proxy rights for another 7%. The room fell silent as Malcolm Washington walked in, followed by Elijah Bennett and Zoe Richardson. "Good morning," Malcolm said calmly. "I believe I'm entitled to attend this meeting as your largest shareholder." Whitfield stood abruptly. "This is preposterous. There's no way you could have acquired that percentage without triggering disclosure requirements." Malcolm nodded to Zoe, who distributed folders to each board member. "My legal team filed all required disclosures. Perhaps you've been too busy with damage control to notice." Harrison flipped through the documents, his face growing increasingly pale. "These appear to be in order," he admitted reluctantly. "This is a hostile takeover," Whitfield declared, his voice rising. "A personal vendetta disguised as corporate activism." "On the contrary," Malcolm replied, taking an empty seat at the table. "This is what accountability looks like. And it's long overdue at Skyline Airways." Before Malcolm could continue, the boardroom doors burst open again. Karen Whitfield stormed in, her face flushed with anger. "You," she pointed at Malcolm. "You think you can destroy what my husband has built because I took your precious seat? This is absurd." "Mrs. Whitfield," Harrison said quietly, "this is a closed board meeting. You cannot be here. Don't tell me where I can and cannot be." Karen snapped. "I've sat through enough of Richard's business dinners to know how these things work. This man," she gestured contemptuously toward Malcolm, "is using his money and influence to punish us for putting him in his place." The racial undertone of her statement hung in the air. Several board members shifted uncomfortably, while others looked down at their tablets, avoiding eye contact. Malcolm remained perfectly composed. "Mrs. Whitfield, thank you for that illuminating demonstration of exactly the attitude that has created this situation." "How dare you," she began, but Richard gripped her arm. "Karen, not now," he hissed. "Don't tell me to be quiet, Richard. I'm tired of being painted as the villain when all I did was expect the service we pay for." As Karen continued her tirade, Malcolm quietly opened his laptop and projected a PowerPoint presentation onto the boardroom's main screen. While Mrs. Whitfield expresses her feelings, he said calmly, "Allow me to share some facts with the board." The presentation began with Skyline stock performance over the past month, followed by customer satisfaction metrics that had been declining well before the incident on Flight 1382. "The issues at Skyline Airways didn't begin with my experience," Malcolm explained as Karen finally fell silent. "They were merely exposed by it." He proceeded to outline a comprehensive report on the company's discriminatory practices, safety concerns that had been systematically ignored, and financial mismanagement that predated the current crisis. "As the largest shareholder in this company, I have a fiduciary interest in seeing these problems addressed," Malcolm continued. "I'm not here to destroy Skyline Airways. I'm here to save it, from itself." Richard Whitfield had recovered his composure enough to mount a counterattack. "This is a transparent attempt to take control of a company worth billions because of a personal slight. The board won't stand for it." "Let's put that to the test," Malcolm suggested. "I move for an immediate vote on the following proposals. 1. A comprehensive external audit of all discrimination complaints and safety concerns. 2. The establishment of an ethics committee with real enforcement powers. And 3. The removal of any board members or executives found to have knowingly enabled discriminatory practices." "You can't just walk in here and demand votes," Whitfield protested. "Actually, as a 31% shareholder, I can," Malcolm replied. "And I've already secured the support of institutional investors representing another 23% of shares." The revelation sent a shock wave through the room. Combined with Malcolm's holdings, that represented a controlling interest in the company. "This is all very irregular," the board chairman stammered. "So is allowing discrimination to become company policy," Malcolm countered. "The choice before this board is simple: adapt to a new era of accountability, or be replaced by those who will." A tense silence fell over the boardroom. Finally, Sandra Chin spoke up. "I second the motion for a vote on Mr. Washington's proposals." One by one, other board members began to voice their support, reading the writing on the wall. Richard Whitfield watched in disbelief as his allies abandoned him. "You'll regret this," he snarled at Malcolm. "I still have friends in this industry. I'll make sure TechFusion never." "Mr. Whitfield," Malcolm interrupted, "I believe you're about to make a threat that could be construed as attempted market manipulation or interference with business relations. Perhaps you'd like to reconsider your words, especially with so many witnesses present." Whitfield fell silent, his face contorted with rage. The vote proceeded, and all three of Malcolm's proposals passed by substantial margins. As the meeting concluded, the board chairman turned to Malcolm. "It seems congratulations are in order, Mr. Washington. You're now effectively in control of Skyline Airways." Malcolm shook his head. "This isn't about control. It's about correction. I didn't set out to own an airline. I set out to change one. And that work is just beginning." As the board members filed out, Richard Whitfield remained seated, staring blankly at the table. Karen stood beside him, her earlier fury now replaced by shock. Malcolm paused at the door. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitfield, I want you to know that this was never about the seat itself. It was about what the seat represented, the belief that some people deserve dignity and respect while others don't." Karen looked up, meeting his gaze for the first time without contempt. Something in her expression had shifted, not quite understanding, but perhaps the beginning of recognition. As Malcolm left the boardroom, Elijah fell into step beside him. "So, what now? You own an airline." Malcolm smiled for the first time that day. "Now we rebuild it into what it should have been all along." Malcolm's first act as Skyline Airways' controlling shareholder was not what anyone expected. Rather than installing himself as CEO or chairman, he established an independent transformation committee composed of industry experts, employee representatives, and diversity specialists. "My goal isn't to run Skyline," he explained at the press conference announcing the changes. "My goal is to transform it into a model for what corporate accountability can look like. The transformation began with a company-wide audit of all discrimination complaints, safety concerns, and customer service issues. Unlike previous internal reviews that had been designed to minimize problems, this audit was conducted by an independent firm with a reputation for thoroughness. The results were sobering. Systematic discrimination had indeed become embedded in company culture, with employees feeling pressured to give preferential treatment to certain passengers while minimizing the concerns of others, particularly people of color. Malcolm implemented a comprehensive training program addressing unconscious bias for all Skyline employees, from flight attendants to executives. Unlike typical corporate diversity training that checked a box without creating real change, this program was ongoing, with regular follow-up sessions and practical applications. "We're not just teaching people what not to say," explained Dr. Amara Johnson, the respected diversity consultant Malcolm brought in to design the program. "We're creating a framework for how to treat everyone with equal dignity and respect." The changes weren't limited to cultural issues. Malcolm leveraged his tech background to implement technological solutions to systemic problems. TechFusion engineers developed a new customer service platform that standardized responses to passenger requests, removing the subjective element that had allowed discrimination to flourish. The seating assignment system was revamped to ensure transparency and fairness, with clear protocols for handling special requests that couldn't be influenced by personal connections or status. "Technology can't solve racism," Malcolm acknowledged in an interview with Tech Today magazine. "But it can create systems that make it harder for unconscious bias to affect outcomes." Karen and Richard Whitfield faced both social and professional consequences for their actions. After initially threatening legal action, they retreated from public view as more evidence of their behavior emerged. Richard resigned from the Skyline board, citing personal reasons, while Karen's social standing in Atlanta high society crumbled as former friends distanced themselves from the scandal. Jasmine Taylor, the young flight attendant who had been berated by Karen, was promoted to lead Skyline's new customer experience team. Her first project was developing guidelines for addressing discriminatory behavior from passengers, an issue that had previously been ignored. "We're empowering our employees to stand up for themselves and each other," Jasmine explained during a staff training session. "No one should have to tolerate abuse as part of their job." Captain Gregory Stevens, who had initially asked Malcolm to move seats to avoid confrontation, became an outspoken advocate for the new policies. He helped reshape pilot training and protocols to emphasize that safety and respect were intertwined values, not competing priorities. "I made the wrong call that day on Flight 1382, Stevens admitted to his fellow pilots during a training session. "I chose convenience over what was right. That's not the kind of airline we want to be." Heather Phillips, the flight attendant who had witnessed the original incident, became a key figure in Skyline's employee advocacy program, creating channels for staff to report concerns without fear of retaliation. Not everyone embraced the changes. Malcolm faced resistance from entrenched executives who viewed the transformation as an overreaction to a single incident. Several senior managers resigned rather than adapt to the new culture, but they were quickly replaced by diverse candidates who brought fresh perspectives to the company. The aviation industry, traditionally conservative and resistant to change, watched Skyline's transformation with skepticism that gradually evolved into reluctant admiration as the company's performance began to improve. Customer satisfaction scores rose, employee retention increased, and 6 months after the changes began, Skyline's stock had not only recovered but surpassed its previous high. Competitors who had initially dismissed Malcolm's approach as woke posturing, found themselves facing pressure from their own shareholders and customers to implement similar reforms. Several major airlines announced new diversity initiatives, though none were as comprehensive as Skyline's. "We're seeing a ripple effect throughout the industry," noted Aviation Weekly in a feature article titled, "The Skyline Effect: How One Incident Changed an Industry." What began as a confrontation over a seat has evolved into a reckoning with long-standing issues of discrimination and inequality in aviation. For Malcolm, navigating the challenges of being a black leader in a predominantly white industry remained complicated. Every decision he made was scrutinized through multiple lenses, and he faced criticism from both those who thought he was doing too much and those who thought he wasn't doing enough. The burden of representation is always heavy, he reflected during a quiet moment in his office, looking out at the skyline fleet on the tarmac below. But so is the opportunity to create lasting change. As the 6-month mark of his involvement with Skyline approached, Malcolm prepared for the National Aviation Conference where he would present the results of the transformation to industry leaders. The conference, held annually in Chicago, was the most prestigious gathering in commercial aviation, attended by CEOs, government officials, and industry innovators. Malcolm's keynote address was scheduled as the closing presentation, a slot usually reserved for the most influential figure in the industry that year. It was a recognition that what had happened at Skyline wasn't just a corporate story but a watershed moment for an entire sector. The night before the conference, Malcolm received an unexpected email from Karen Whitfield. He hesitated before opening it, unsure what to expect after months of silence from both Whitfields. "Mr. Washington," the message began formally. "I've been following the changes at Skyline with interest. While I'm not prepared to say I was wrong about everything, I am beginning to understand that my perspective was limited by my experiences. If you're willing, I would like to hear more about your vision for the company my husband spent 20 years building. Respectfully, Karen Whitfield." It wasn't an apology, but it was an opening, a crack in the wall of privilege and prejudice that had seemed impenetrable 6 months earlier. Malcolm replied with an invitation to attend his keynote address, not expecting she would accept. As he finalized his presentation in the early hours of the morning, Malcolm reflected on how far Skyline had come, and how far it still had to go. The transformation wasn't complete, and perhaps it never would be. Real change wasn't a destination but a continuous journey of improvement and accountability. But something fundamental had shifted, not just at Skyline but throughout the industry. A conversation had begun that couldn't be silenced, and actions were being taken that couldn't be undone. All because he had refused to quietly accept being removed from his rightful seat. The grand ballroom of the Chicago Marriott downtown fell silent as Malcolm Washington approached the podium. 600 aviation industry leaders, government officials, and media representatives watched intently as he adjusted the microphone. 6 months ago, Malcolm began, his voice steady and clear, "I boarded Flight 1382 from Atlanta to San Francisco. I was assigned Seat 2A. A ripple of knowing laughter moved through the audience. The incident had become so well known that the mere mention of the seat number evoked recognition. What happened next has been well documented, Malcolm continued. What hasn't been as widely discussed is what happened afterward, not just to me personally, but to Skyline Airways and to the aviation industry as a whole. The screen behind him illuminated with the new Skyline Airways logo, a sleek, modern design that had replaced the outdated corporate branding as part of the company's transformation. Today, I'm not here to rehash the past but to share results, Malcolm said. In 6 months, Skyline Airways has undergone a fundamental transformation, not just in policy but in culture. And the numbers speak for themselves. Charts appeared on the screen showing Skyline's improved performance metrics, customer satisfaction up 32%, employee retention increased by 24%, and stock price reaching an all-time high, 43% above pre-incident levels. These aren't just feel-good statistics, Malcolm emphasized. They represent real business value created by addressing systemic problems that have been ignored for too long. As Malcolm detailed the specific changes implemented at Skyline, from the bias training programs to the technological innovations to the restructured customer service protocols, he noticed a figure slip into the back of the ballroom. Karen Whitfield had accepted his invitation after all. She stood stiffly, arms crossed, watching with an unreadable expression as Malcolm continued his presentation. The most significant change at Skyline hasn't been policy or procedure, Malcolm said. It's been a shift in perspective, from viewing diversity and inclusion as compliance issues to recognizing them as competitive advantages. He clicked to the next slide, which showed Skyline's dramatically improved diversity metrics at all levels of the organization, from the boardroom to the flight deck. When people ask me if this transformation was worth the investment, I point to these numbers, Malcolm said. But I also remind them that this was never just about business metrics. It was about creating an environment where everyone, employees and passengers alike, is treated with equal dignity and respect. Malcolm paused, scanning the audience. And that brings me to the announcement I'm most proud to make today. The screen changed to show a group of young people from diverse backgrounds, all wearing Skyline-branded attire. I'm pleased to introduce the Skyline Future Aviators program, Malcolm announced. A scholarship initiative providing full funding for flight school and aviation management education to students from underrepresented communities. Applause erupted, led by Jasmine Taylor and Captain Stevens, who were seated in the front row alongside Heather Phillips and other Skyline employees who had been instrumental in the company's transformation. The first cohort of 50 students begins training next month, Malcolm continued when the applause subsided. By 2030, we project that over 500 new pilots, engineers, and aviation executives will have entered the industry through this program, fundamentally changing the face of commercial aviation. As Malcolm outlined the details of the scholarship program, he noticed Karen Whitfield's rigid posture gradually softening, her crossed arms dropping to her sides. "Now, I'd like to show you something," Malcolm said, his tone becoming more solemn. "With permission from those involved, I'm going to play the original video that started this journey." The screen displayed the now famous footage from Flight 1382, Malcolm politely pointing out that Karen was in his seat, her dismissive response, the escalating tension, and finally, Malcolm reluctantly moving to accommodate her. The ballroom was completely silent as the clip ended. "I've watched this video hundreds of times," Malcolm admitted. "Not out of anger or resentment, but as a reminder of a fundamental truth: how we respond to injustice matters more than the injustice itself." He looked directly at Karen Whitfield as he continued. "I could have responded with rage. I could have responded with resignation. Instead, I chose to respond with resolution, a commitment to address not just this incident but the systems that made it possible." Malcolm's gaze returned to the broader audience. The original video went viral because it touched a nerve. It represented an experience that was all too familiar to too many people. But viral moments fade. What matters is what we build in their wake. He clicked to his final slide, which showed the interior of a Skyline aircraft with passengers and crew of visibly diverse backgrounds interacting with mutual respect. "This is the future of aviation," Malcolm declared. "Not just diverse in appearance but inclusive in practice. Not just saying the right things but doing them, consistently and systematically." The applause began slowly, then built to a standing ovation that lasted nearly 2 minutes. As industry leaders rose to their feet, Malcolm noticed Karen Whitfield standing as well, her expression thoughtful rather than hostile. When the applause finally subsided, Malcolm concluded his address. "6 months ago, I was removed from my seat. Today, we're building an industry where everyone has a seat at the table. Thank you." As Malcolm stepped away from the podium, he was immediately surrounded by aviation executives eager to discuss implementing similar changes at their companies. The transformation he had started at Skyline was poised to spread throughout the industry. After nearly an hour of conversations, Malcolm found himself face to face with Karen Whitfield, who had waited patiently at the edge of the crowd. "Mr. Washington," she began, her voice lacking its former imperious tone. "Your speech was enlightening." Malcolm nodded, waiting for her to continue. "I still don't agree with how you went about things," she said, a hint of her old defensiveness returning. "Taking over Richard's company was extreme." "It wasn't about taking over," Malcolm corrected gently. "It was about transformation. And it wasn't Richard's company, it belonged to its shareholders, employees, and customers." Karen was silent for a moment, then surprised him. "The scholarship program," she said hesitantly. "It's a good idea. Richard and we have some connections in the industry that might be helpful in expanding it." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was something Malcolm hadn't expected, an olive branch, however small. "I'd be interested in discussing that," he replied, handing her his business card. Real change requires input from all perspectives, even those that once seemed opposed. As Karen walked away, Elijah Bennett approached. "Did I just see you talking civilly with Karen Whitfield?" The same woman who took your seat and called security on you? Malcolm smiled. The point was never to defeat the Whitfields. It was to change the system that empowered their behavior. And you've done that, Elijah acknowledged, gesturing to the room full of aviation executives still buzzing with excitement about Malcolm's presentation. You've changed an entire industry by refusing to accept discrimination as the cost of doing business. Malcolm's phone buzzed with a notification. Skyline's stock had jumped another 7% following his keynote address. Not bad for a guy who just wanted to work during his flight, Elijah quipped. Malcolm laughed, but his thoughts were already turning to the future. The transformation at Skyline was just the beginning. There were other industries, other systems that needed similar accountability. As he looked around the ballroom at the faces of those who had once been skeptical but were now eager to follow Skyline's example, Malcolm felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The seat he'd lost on Flight 1382 had led him to create something far more significant, a blueprint for change that could be applied well beyond the aviation industry. What had begun as a moment of humiliation had become a movement for transformation. And that, Malcolm reflected as he prepared to leave the conference, was the most powerful response to discrimination imaginable. Not just standing up for yourself, but creating systems that ensured others wouldn't have to face the same battles. In the end, it had never really been about the seat. It had been about dignity, respect, and the courage to demand both, not just for himself, but for everyone. What would you do if you were in Malcolm's position? Would you have taken the same approach, or handled things differently? Drop a comment below with your thoughts. And if you found this story inspiring, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message of standing up against discrimination. Remember, real change happens when we refuse to accept injustice as normal. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Malcolm Washington's journey demonstrates that true change requires strategic action, not just emotional reaction. When faced with discrimination, he chose a path of calculated response rather than helpless acceptance or unproductive rage. His experience teaches us several valuable lessons. First, individual incidents of racism often reflect systemic problems. Malcolm recognized that Karen's behavior wasn't isolated but symptomatic of deeper issues within Skyline Airways and the aviation industry. Second, lasting change requires addressing root causes. Rather than seeking personal revenge, Malcolm focused on transforming the systems that enabled discrimination. By acquiring controlling interest in Skyline, he positioned himself to implement meaningful reforms that benefited everyone. Third, business success and ethical practices can align perfectly. The improvements Malcolm implemented didn't just create a more equitable environment, they delivered measurable business results, proving that doing the right thing can also be profitable. Fourth, accountability must be structural, not just personal. While Karen and Richard faced consequences, Malcolm's primary focus was creating mechanisms that prevented similar incidents regardless of who was involved. Finally, the story shows that our response to injustice defines us more than the injustice itself. Malcolm transformed a humiliating experience into an opportunity for industry-wide change, demonstrating that dignity comes not from never being disrespected, but from how we respond when we are. What would you do if faced with discrimination like Malcolm experienced? Would you confront it directly, walk away, or devise a strategic response? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story about standing up to racism resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to see more powerful stories of transformation and justice. Don't forget to share this video with someone who needs encouragement to stand up against discrimination in their own life. Remember, change happens one decision at a time, and your response to injustice today could create ripples of transformation tomorrow. Thank you for watching, and stay resilient in your own journey toward creating a more equitable world.